today. This is a fabulous day to kick off our library's Spring 2011 lecture series, Arts and Lecture Series. This one is titled Immigration, Humanity on the Move. We really are happy to have you here because this is going to be a series all spring with 6 presentations. And what I do want to remind you is that this was one of the topics that we covered, one of the issues that we covered in the last election series that we had, lecture series, called It Matters, Engage, Participate, Vote. And immigration was one of the issues that was really thought to be most interesting and in great need of more elaboration. So that's what we're doing this spring. So you will find the listing, in case you haven't seen it. Zillions of these postcards everywhere. There are a bunch at the back there, and the flyer, and of course on the library's website. So take a look for what's coming later. And then also, don't miss the exhibit in the art gallery downstairs. It is called Miracles on the Border. You might have dropped in there, folk paintings of Mexican migrants to the U.S. Very compelling too. Now, the library has many partners to thank for planning this series, but with their indulgence, I'm not going to do that at this moment in the interest of time, and we'll get to that later. What I want to do now is to introduce today's speaker and thank him for coming all the way from Davis. We have Kevin Johnson with us today, who's going to kick off this lecture series and set a little bit of context for us. But I'll tell you, he has a point of view, and this is the cover of your latest book, Kevin, or one of your latest books, and it's called Opening the Floodgates, Why America Needs to Rethink Its Borders and Immigration Laws. So let me tell you that Kevin Johnson is Dean of the Law School at University of California, Davis. He is also Professor of Public Interest Law and Chicano and Chicano Studies. He holds a BA in Economics from the University of California in Berkeley and a law degree, magna cum laude, from Harvard University. His publications, presentations, various interest groups, political activities is a lengthy list, so I'll refer you to the website at the law school at Davis. Too numerous to mention now. What we're hoping, even though he has a point of view, is that he'll give us just a little bit of context to help us understand where this is coming from. So please help me welcome Dean Kevin Johnson.
Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to participate in this Arts and Lecture series focusing on immigration, humanity on the move. This is my first opportunity to be on the Sonoma State campus. I'm very pleased to be here. One of my favorite students from law school, one of my civil procedure students I taught years ago, Marlon Kobar, who's now an attorney with the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., was a graduate of Sonoma State. And actually, I emailed him this morning saying, I'm going to visit your alma mater. And he spoke very, very fondly of his days here. So I'm happy to be here. And I want to talk a little bit about immigration, a little bit about some views I have on immigration. But just to give you an idea a little bit where I'm coming from, I have written and taught and worked on briefs in courts from local district courts to the United States Supreme Court on immigration matters. I've written scholarship on the subject. I've worked with the California legislature, and I was part of the immigration policy group of then Senator Obama's campaign and tried to come up with some immigration policy positions. And over the last few years, I've probably talked I have talked across the country on immigration. And I tell you that because the reactions I get in different places they run the gamut. I was in Dallas a couple of years ago. I gave a talk about my book, and the question that was posed to me initially was from a fellow wearing camouflage fatigues who asked me, what part of illegal don't you understand? And the second question was from a local city council member who asked me, well, I didn't apparently believe in enforcing the immigration laws. Did I believe in enforcing the DUI laws? I told her I didn't really have I wasn't really talking about the DUI laws, and I hoped they were enforced. What I can say in talking about immigration is this is an issue that's touched the entire nation. In southern Indiana, I gave a talk at the University of Indiana Bloomington a while ago, and it's a very big issue there. It's an issue in New Orleans where we've seen large numbers of immigrants go to help work and reconstruct Hurricane Katrina devastated Gulf. Go to South Carolina, North Carolina, Iowa. Actually, one of the biggest immigration rates in the United States history was a couple of years ago in a small town called Postville, Iowa, an agro-processing plant, poultry indeed. So this is an issue that's touched the entire nation. It's not just an issue in California, even though regionally immigration is a hot issue. In the Southwest, obviously, it's a hot issue. In the way that I look at immigration, in the way that I talk about immigration, is it really is a difficult and hard issue that touches on people and people's lives, and civil rights and labor rights, and employers. And it touches on all of our society in many ways. And it's incredibly complex politically and legally. And if you talk to anybody who has simple answers and quick solutions, I would be very suspicious of their easy, quick fixes. Because I don't think there is one. Politically, immigration isn't easy to categorize. It's not a red state, blue state issue, Democrat, Republican issue. We have presidents, or some presidents who are Republicans, who, in my view, have been much better on immigration than presidents who are Democrats. I think President Bush, for example, I probably have much more in common with on his immigration positions than I probably did with President Clinton, even though many of my views may be categorized as Democratic. I think that we have Democrats who want to close the borders. We have Democrats who want to allow for more liberal admissions. We have Republicans who are for more liberal admissions. We have Republicans who want to close the borders. So I think politically, it's very difficult. And legally, and I won't bore you with the legal details today, but legally, immigration law is one of the most complicated areas of laws that you can imagine. It is, actually I started thinking about this recently for other reasons, but it is a notoriously complex statute that some people say is only rivaled by the Internal Revenue Code for its complexity. And it's got a set of rules that otherwise, if they applied to citizens, would be patently unconstitutional. You can keep out poor people from entering the United States. You can keep out people from particular races and national origins in the immigration laws. The Supreme Court won't blink an eye in many ways. But if you were to do that against citizens, you get into all kinds of trouble. But legally, immigration law is incredibly complex. And as I mentioned before, it's politically complex, it's legally complex, and it's not just a regional issue. It's a national issue. Now, if I focus on undocumented immigration, that is, immigrants who are in this country who don't have legal papers, I think there's some basic things that people can agree on, and I want to sort of outline some sort of basic facts, because I think these facts are important in thinking about undocumented immigration. And that's a large part of the current debate about immigration deals with undocumented immigration. What do we do with the millions of people who are here against the law, or here in violation of the law? Fact number one, I'd say, is basically undisputed. We have millions of undocumented immigrants who live in the United States. Best estimates are somewhere between 10.5 and 11.5 million undocumented immigrants live in the United States. This actually is an increase over how many undocumented immigrants we had in the early 1990s. Around 1994, we probably had, we're estimating, this is what social scientists do, make estimates based on census data. But the best estimates are that around 1994, we had about 5 or 6 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States. Now we have roughly double that. And we have roughly double that even though over the last 15 years, we have increased the amount of money we spend on immigration and border enforcement by incredible amounts. We're spending more now than we ever have in terms of enforcement ever in United States history. We have a larger undocumented immigrant population now, even though we've deported more people in the last few years than ever have been deported in United States history. We have more undocumented immigrants now, even though we have detained more immigrants than we ever have in United States history. And we have more undocumented immigrants than any time in United States history, even though we have tried to build fences and create other strategies along the border to minimize crossing the border. But that's, I mean, we have an awful lot, we have millions of undocumented immigrants living here. Another fact that most wouldn't dispute is that most undocumented immigrants come here to work. They come here for jobs. To the extent there's a magnet in the United States, the magnet is employment. Maybe employment in violation of the law, but it's employment. There's very little social science data suggesting that undocumented immigrants come here for, the majority, the vast majority of undocumented immigrants come here for any other reason except for jobs. Another sort of fact, it's an important one actually if you're thinking about border enforcement. And this is sort of a technical, legal one that you might not like, but it's an important one in thinking about what we can do to deal with the undocumented immigrant population. There are two types of undocumented immigrants, and about 50% fall into each of these two categories, 50% of undocumented immigrants. You have people who entered without inspection, people who crossed the borders without going to a port of entry, people who came through the desert in southern Arizona or South Texas or near San Diego. People enter without inspection. Another half of the undocumented immigrant population are people who entered lawfully, came here with the requisite immigration papers, but then violated the terms of their visa. They were students who decided couldn't afford to pay, they couldn't stay in school, or got a job instead, or people came here on a tourist visa and decided they're going to stay, or people came on a business visa, came and decided they're going to stay longer. They're called visa overstays. So about half the undocumented immigrant population is for people entered without inspection, and about half are what are called visa overstays. Well, why does that matter to anybody other than a law professor? It matters because if you focus on things like building bigger border fences and spending more money on the border patrol and increasing enforcement along the border, that's only going to deal with half the problem. People enter without inspection. It's not going to deal with visa overstays. If you really want to concern yourself with undocumented immigration generally, you have to think, well, what do we do for people who violate the terms of their visas? This fact, it's not really a fact, it's a bunch of facts I put together. A lot of people think that our current system's broken. It's just not working right. And there are people who think we're not, on all different political persuasions who think the current system is broken. Some people think there's not enough enforcement. Other people think there's too much enforcement. But most people would say that some of these problems we have are just, hard to accept. We've got a large undocumented population. We have problems with human trafficking where people smuggle people across the borders for money. We have a person a day who dies along the southern border of Mexico trying to cross illegally through the desert. And this is, we're talking about thousands of people since we started militarizing. That's what we've done in the United States, militarizing the southern border since early '94. We have problems, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but this is a real serious problem. We have problems of labor exploitation, where employers take advantage of undocumented immigrants in the workplace and don't pay minimum wages, don't honor the conditions that are required by law. We have undocumented immigrants who feel that they have no choice except to work under the conditions that violate the law. They want to continue to work. So those are some of the basic facts. And for the last few years, what's been going on is a debate in Congress and among the public about what should we do about reforming our immigration laws. If we think there's a problem, what do we do? And a few years ago, Congress started talking about immigration reform. Probably 2005, 2006, there was very serious discussion of immigration reform. There was a very tough immigration enforcement bill passed by the House in December 2005. You may remember that and among other things, it would have criminalized the status of being undocumented, meaning people could be put in jail if they're undocumented. It would criminalize certain assistance given to undocumented people. It would have made things a lot tougher. Maybe you think it's right, or maybe not. But it would have been very enforcement oriented. What happened after that bill was passed, that there were marches across the country, very large marches, tens of thousands of people, and it wasn't just Latinos who were marching in Chicago. And you saw many Polish immigrants, many of the Polish community, Irish community march as well. But there were mass marches across the country protesting the toughness of the Sensenbrenner bill. And then there were other discussions of immigration reform, more middle-of-the-road discussions. And one of the questions that came up is, well, what kind of immigration reform that doesn't just focus on enforcement would be good for the country? And in its discussion of immigration reform, and it's still being discussed currently in Congress, it's gone up and down. But the current discussion focuses on some kind of program for legalization for the millions of undocumented people, some kind of liberalization of our legal immigration laws, because some people think, well, the reason we have, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, the reason we have so many undocumented immigrants is because there's not legal ways for them to come to the United States, especially for low-skilled and medium-skilled people. There are very few ways of legally coming to this country unless you have a family member here. So some have said we need to make more liberal, more employment-oriented our immigration laws. And some have said, well, along those lines, we need some kind of guest worker program. Maybe focusing on agriculture, maybe focusing on broader than that. And the last thing, and this is part of every immigration reform bill, is more enforcement. And that's the most popular thing with many segments of the American public, is more immigration enforcement. So those are the things that have been talked about for a number of years. And I think it's useful in thinking about immigration reform to think, well, what do our current immigration laws do? Our current immigration laws are very narrow in certain ways. They're designed to keep people out. The presumption is you cannot enter the United States unless you fall into one of four categories. And these categories are relatively narrow. One is you have to have one category for family immigrant visas. If you marry, the easiest way to immigrate here, if you were to marry a U.S. citizen, if you're a foreigner, you come to the United States. There are some other categories, some other preferences, but relatively small. Even smaller, though, are the employment visas. There's a series of employment visas that very much make it very easy for, and I don't mean to make fun, but if you're a Nobel Prize winner or a professional athlete, it's very easy to come here under immigration laws. If you're a medium, low-skilled, or medium-skilled worker, or some other kind of professional, much harder. In fact, for most low and medium-skilled workers, unless you have a family member, there's no legal way to come to the United States. There's two even smaller categories after you get to family and employment. There's a diversity visa program. You may have referred to as the diversity lottery. And it's designed to give visas to countries that don't send any immigrants to the United States. It tends to benefit people from parts of Europe and Africa that don't ordinarily have high immigration numbers to the United States. It doesn't benefit at all people from Mexico and Latin America. They're almost always ineligible for any diversity visas. And a fourth category, and it's a case-by-case category, it's refugees, people who have fled persecution. Which is hard to prove. You have to prove it on a case-by-case basis. That's actually how I got interested in immigration laws, handling asylum cases for people from El Salvador in the 1980s. People who fled the country because they feared they or their families would get killed. So those are the four categories. And some would say, the employment ones are just too narrow. And some employers say that as well. And employers may have slightly different interests than some of the workers who want to come to the country. But there are some concerns with the current immigration laws. Now, what I talk about, and I'm not going to go on all that much longer, but what I talk about in my book, and when I try to argue, is that we should try to, in some ways, deregulate the borders and to simplify the current immigration laws, and to make it easier for legal immigrants to come here legally, and to focus our border security efforts not on just keeping out everybody, but keeping out people who are true dangers to our society, criminals and national security terrorists, if you want to call them that. Because currently we have a system that millions of people violate and that is unsafe as we could imagine happening, because we have a massive human smuggling ongoing. We have a scattershot effort to keep everybody out. It's porous at best. And we don't focus our efforts on true dangers to society. So I guess I don't argue for open borders, but I say that we should have more open borders than we currently have. And how do I get to that conclusion? I come to that conclusion by asking a number of questions. One, what is enforceable? What kind of immigration laws can we enforce? We apparently can't enforce the current immigration laws, and I don't believe, and I don't think there's any evidence supporting that the federal government just doesn't want to enforce the immigration laws, and that's why they're not being enforced. I think that when you have laws that are not realistic, they're not going to be enforceable. We have immigration laws that are violated on a widespread basis, that large companies violate on a daily basis. You can go to any Home Depot, basically in the West. I can go to the square in Hillsburg and find day laborers, some of them undocumented, at any point in time, because they can get hired and they can get jobs. We currently have a system where some people who are otherwise law-abiding, violate the immigration laws by hiring undocumented people to work in their homes, in their yards. We had two people who were nominated for the Attorney General position in President Clinton's administration, Zoe Baird and Kimball Wood, who both were later disqualified because they hired undocumented immigrants in the home. And it wasn't just a Democrat issue, because George Bush wanted to nominate Linda Chavez to be Secretary of Labor, and she had a similar problem. And even, actually more ironically, he wanted to nominate Bernard Kerik, the former police chief of New York City, to be the first director of the Department of Homeland Security, which enforces the immigration laws, and he couldn't take that job because he employed undocumented immigrants in the home. I mean, what I guess what I'm saying is that we have a system that, and I think these people are all law-abiding people, but there's a lot of people who violate the immigration laws on a regular basis, employers as well as ordinary workers. We have a current system that, in my view, is not all that different than the anti-alcohol laws and how they were enforced during Prohibition. Violated on a widespread basis, led to the creation of criminal networks, led to problems in the court system with the court loads, and were not respected or viewed as legitimate by the public at large. But we currently have a system that really is not enforceable. So I'm thinking, what can we do that would be enforceable? Second question I think about is what kind of immigration system is good for our economy and politically and socially for the United States? A selfish vision of immigration. And I would say that a more open system of immigration is good. And that's not to say that there aren't some cost of immigration. But overall, if you look at what workers bring, most economists will tell you that one of they bring economic benefits as a whole in the aggregate to the economy. And if you look at most studies, you'll see that it is in fact the case. There are some real issues, though, when it comes to the economics of immigration. Two issues I guess I'd mention, and I could go into some discussion if you like, is that there is some evidence that low-skilled workers are adversely affected by immigrant labor. The numbers tend to be fairly small, but you're talking about small numbers that are big to the most vulnerable people in the labor market. It tends to be people who don't have high school degrees. And some would say, and Patrick Buchanan has said this, and Lou Dobbs said it, is that most skilled African Americans are most negatively affected by immigrant labor. And I mean, and that's a legitimate concern. That is a legitimate concern. And although it seems rare for Patrick Buchanan and Lou Dobbs to be voicing concerns of African American workers, except in that circumstance. I think that that's a real issue, the impacts on low-skilled workers. But then the question is, well, how do you deal with it? That's a fair enough question. My response would be, you don't deal with it by building a bigger border fence. You deal with it by enforcing wage and labor protections. If that's what you're concerned with, workers and how they're treated, then focus on workers and how they're treated, not focusing indirectly by trying to build fences or use other enforcement devices that really aren't going to solve the problem. Another issue, and this is actually a very real economic issue, is that there are a lot of costs of immigration that are imposed and paid for at the state and local level. I'll give you one example. It's a big ticket item. K-12 education tends to be paid, at the state and local level. And the Supreme Court has held in a case that was decided in 1982, Pliable versus Doe, that you have to provide an undocumented child with a K-12 education. That can be costly. If you're talking about a large number of undocumented immigrant children, that can be costly, particularly in times of tight budgets and budget cutbacks. And in many states where K-12 education is funded by property taxes, and when the tax base is declining, it's especially tough. And I think that many of the benefits of immigration go to the federal government through federal tax revenues that tend to be the bulk of tax revenues. And actually, one thing that most people don't realize is that many, actually more than 50% of undocumented immigrants in the country do file federal tax returns and aren't eligible for many what are called tax benefits, things like the earned income tax credit, things like that. But they contribute billions to the economy, and they also contribute billions in tax revenues, and that goes to the federal government. And actually, the biggest benefit to the federal government is through the Social Security system. If an undocumented immigrant's working on a fake Social Security number, or either one that's made up or somebody else's, they're having money taken from their paycheck and contributing to a system that they're never going to collect from. The money's going to go into Social Security, and we're talking about billions of dollars every year for benefits that the undocumented person's not going to ever collect. And so, I mean, for those reasons, it's not entirely surprising that the Internal Revenue Service and the Social Security Administration never really ask where money's coming from. They just take the money, and they don't care if it's from a documented person or an undocumented person. And they both, you can file a federal tax return without a Social Security number. All you need is a tax identification number. And any undocumented person who's ever consulted with an attorney about possibly getting his or her status legal is told, pay your taxes. And actually, all these immigration reform proposals are also saying that people would have to pay their taxes if they haven't paid them, and that's why. But I think if your concern is, that locals are paying too much for services like K through 12 education, then I say the response isn't building a bigger border fence or passing a state and local immigration law, which is a whole other set of questions, but asking the federal government for assistance. And that's what some border governors have done for a long period of time. Bill Richardson did it in New Mexico. Janet Napolitano did it in Arizona when she was governor of Arizona. But my focus would be, well, we shouldn't just, if you're worried about the economics, you should focus on getting help from the federal government, which ostensibly is in charge of immigration to begin with, which is a whole other set of issues. The third question I think about, what kind of, in coming up with a solution, what kind of immigration system is consistent with our constitutional and moral traditions? And I'm not saying that more open borders are required by the Constitution, but what I am saying is that a more open society is more consistent with what our Constitution envisions and what our moral traditions embrace. Well, we have a Constitution that's deeply committed to individual rights and is based on a theory that individuals, in fact, have rights, but we have a system now that closes the border and denies access to all but a very few people. Much easier, in my mind, to envision a more open system consistent with our constitutional tradition. And I think a more open system would deal with some of the moral tragedies of our current immigration systems. Tragedies like deaths on the border, like human trafficking and human smuggling, like the exploitation of workers. I think a more open system would be better and more consistent with our moral traditions. And I'll be very brief. There's so many problems with what I've told you that I'm sure you'll point out to me. The two of them I'll just mention at the front end. One is, well, if we make it easier for people to come, we're just going to open the floodgates to the entire world. Or we're going to be overrun by millions and millions and millions of people. That is an experiment that the European Union engaged in when it started allowing the migration of people within Europe. And the concern initially was, particularly expressed by France and Germany, if you allow labor migration within the EU, we're going to be deluged with Spaniards and Portuguese, and the neighbors are going to go down the tank. And it's just not going to be the same. And there was a great deal of concern about that. The EU was, did allow for labor migration. They've had their ups and downs, some issues, but it wasn't mass migrations like people feared. There was some initial sort of movement of people in response to labor demands. But most of the French, actually most of the Portuguese stayed in Portugal, most of the Spaniards stayed in Spain, for all kinds of obvious reasons to us. You look at Puerto Rico. Everybody in Puerto Rico is born there as a citizen. The average income, the standard of living, the federal benefits available to Puerto Ricans on the island are less than they would be on the mainland. All Puerto Ricans could, since they're U.S. citizens, could get on a plane and fly to the United States tomorrow. But most Puerto Ricans, even though the economy isn't as good as the mainland, stay in Puerto Rico. Most people stay as opposed to move. In fact, economist who was speculating that 95% of the world dies within 100 miles where they were born. I don't know if that's still the case, but most people prefer not to migrate rather than migrate. So I think the floodgates concern is probably overstated. But if you do have a concern with numbers, then I'd say maybe if in opening up the system you just have a number, you limit it for a few years until you're more comfortable with what the numbers might be. You say, it's going to be 1 million people or 2 million people, whatever your arbitrary number is, until we're more comfortable with it. Another concern, what about national security? September 11th. This guy hasn't even talked about September 11th. Changed everything. There are terrorism concerns, there's wars, look at Egypt, there's all kinds of stuff going on. The current system has 12 million people living off the books. It has millions of people who aren't registered, who we don't know much about, who live in the United States. I think most of them are fine. But we don't even have a system for tracking the people who are in the United States. Having a system where most people came here legally would allow us to better track who's in the country, why they're here, and what they're doing. And to focus our energies on keeping out people we want to keep out. People who are criminals or real danger to us, real terrorists, things like that. So I think that in a related issue, I shouldn't even raise this because usually I get yelled at for this one too. Driver's licenses. Why we would want anybody driving on the road without a license doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Most police, the dispute's been going on for many years. Basically, undocumented immigrants in almost all states now. New Mexico may even change their rule. Washington may change their rule. They're the only 2 states that had allowed undocumented immigrants to obtain a license. California used to allow undocumented immigrants to obtain a license. And many police chiefs would prefer that people, that undocumented immigrants be eligible for a license. And what the police chiefs, they're not soft on crime, I don't think, but they want as many people as possible on the driver's license database. Driver's license database is one of the things that all police officers use to track people. And if you're don't have a license, you're in some ways off the grid. It makes it harder to enforce the criminal laws. But there are other reasons why I think you should want to license all drivers. One of them is, and I have some skepticism about this because I have 3 teenagers who've gone through driver's training. At least the licensing process is supposed to train them to drive better. Even if it doesn't achieve that goal, you can't get liability insurance unless you have a license. It's in my interest, as well as everybody's interest here, that as many people who are driving on the road or have liability insurance as are on the road. So now what we have is we have millions of people without driver's licenses who don't have insurance, and that's not an ideal system. But let me stop there because I've said a number of things that you either liked or didn't like, and I'd be interested in hearing questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions.
I was a tax preparer for Spanish-speaking clients primarily here, and I just wanted to say thank you for bringing up the Social Security issue. A lot of people don't know about that, and I think it's a status quo agreement. They're allowed to get the iTunes. And you know who the biggest employers are of Hispanic workers? In this county?
I guess agriculture. Why?
No.
Who?
McDonald's.
Really?
Round Table, Taco Bell, all these corporations are given carte blanche to hire who they want. And they do file state taxes because they get garnished if they don't pay state tax.
Just a lot less.
So there is some state movement. And is that 12 million? Is that adult population or adult?
All.
That's a really small amount of people going to California public schools. And if you take that and divide that.
Although there's probably 25% of the undocumented population of the state is in California. There's a lot in California.
But if you take the demographics down, how many school children?
Yeah. And I might agree with you, although some districts are more affected than others. I don't think the Beverly Hills school system is much affected, but I think probably the East LA schools probably are.
And you're correct, and there are many agricultural employers, but it's a very smaller amount, and there's a lot of self-employed people who have their own business. And they're all...
Who are violating the law by having their own business.
And they all come through three parts that I just then I'll finish. They're exploited when they're hired, like you said, by unfair labor. And if they manage to collect enough money to actually get a house, they're exploited by the lenders. And then eventually, if they do become a resident, they can get their Social Security and transfer it if they have all those numbers they've worked under. So they might be able to get out by the time.
And the other part, and I didn't mention this, but there's a part of in California, but it's not all Mexicans, but it tends to disproportionately affect the Mexican immigrant community because there are more Mexican immigrants than from Bulgaria, for example. So it has a racial impact as well as just immigration impact.
You said that being self-employed and you're undocumented, that is not breaking the law? Is that what you said?
Generally speaking, that's true. I mean, it's unlawful to be employed if you're undocumented. If you're not employed, meaning you're self-employed, that's not a violation of that law.
So you can charge people for doing something, but you're not employed.
Yeah, it's a good question because there's a whole body of law about who's an employee and who's not an employee. And actually, the most common sort of independent contractor relationship is what newspapers have with paper boys and girls. Is they're all independent contractors, so they don't have to be paid minimum wage. They don't have to be given wage protections. But there's you can look at somebody who does the yard as an independent contractor or not. But it is if you're the immigration sanctions, the employer sanctions apply to employers who employ undocumented immigrants.
Well, it seems like you need to extend your view a little bit into the employment thing a little more. You said they're here for jobs. Then we need to look at the structure of jobbing, Social Security, a lot of these other things that are imposed on businesses that they are avoiding by hiring them.
I think that's exactly right. I think that you're right that if you're interested in dealing with undocumented immigrant labor and its impact on the labor market, you should focus on enforcing the wage laws, enforcing the benefit laws, enforcing all the contributions employers are required to make, hours and condition laws. That's the way. I mean, and then just destroy the incentive for opting for undocumented immigrant labor as opposed to legal labor.
Your corporate lobbyists are never going to allow that, like McDonald's. They want that cheap labor, and they do take Social Security on those numbers. So they're not getting out of anything except paying a fair wage and keeping people longer. So they don't have to pay health care and things like that.
What do you think about the proposal by some Republicans that a child born of an undocumented mother is not a citizen?
Yeah, now, that's a good question. The 14th Amendment is pretty clear on this, and almost all, I can think of two in the United States, actually three constitutional law professors in the United States who think that you wouldn't need a constitutional amendment to get rid of, get rid of birthright citizenship. The 14th Amendment was added by Congress to make sure that nobody born in this country was denied citizenship. And they created a bright line rule for that. And it was designed to overrule a case that you may have heard of, some people think, probably rightly, helped cause the Civil War, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott dealt with a situation where a freed slave, an African American, was found by a court, Supreme Court, not to be a citizen of the United States and not deserving of the rights of citizens of the United States. So he was a free black person on American soil out of the rights of a citizen, including, all they can think about right to vote, things like that. 14th Amendment was designed to say, no, that's wrong. Anybody born here should be a citizen, except for the children of foreign diplomats who are on our soil. And actually, foreign diplomats also have this immunity from prosecution for crimes and civil liability. So if they get in a car accident, there's nothing you can do. Maybe we should treat undocumented immigrants like that. They're like foreign diplomats, and they don't have citizenship, but they can do what. That's a joke. But I think most people would say that unless you amend the 14th Amendment, you can't take away the citizenship of anybody born in the United States except for foreign diplomats. Now, some states are making noises. Arizona actually had a law that yesterday didn't make it out, for a hearing, that would have tried to deny birth certificates to the children born here of undocumented immigrants. Lindsey Graham and others in the U.S. Senate have made noises about either a constitutional amendment of some sort, but I don't see it happening. You need to get 2/3 of a vote of the House and the Senate to amend the 14th Amendment. Then it would have to go to the states, and 3/4 of the states would have to ratify it. And the last amendment that failed was the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s. Very, very hard to ratify an amendment. And I just don't see it going anywhere here. It would require years of political action. And I don't think, and so why are people doing this? I think that these arguments are being made to kind of stir up people about immigration and dealing with immigration, talking about anchor babies and illegal aliens, and we need to do something. And I agree with some of that. I agree we need to do something. But one of the things I think we really need to do is try to have a reasoned discussion about the issues. I mean, as opposed to calling people idiots or saying that they're racist or saying that that they're anti. I mean, I think that these are hard issues. People have to talk about them, and making kind of wacky arguments about getting rid of birthright citizenship without a constitutional amendment. I think it's not going to move the ball forward. I mean, I do think that we are at a weird time in our history where sometimes it's hard to have serious discussions about serious issues. I mean, we've been having well, not all of us, but some of us have had discussion over what I view as a non-issue, whether the president was born in the United States or not, for several years. But I wish we would focus on the real hard issues here, because they are difficult issues. They involve what we are as a society, how we want to treat people who come here, and affects the labor markets, affects our schools, and all those things. But it's much harder to have that discussion than I would hope.
Two different kinds of questions. I heard another immigration lawyer say that the reason so many people come here from Mexico is that their markets are so flooded with cheap food imported from the States that farmers there can't sell their corn and beans because American corn and beans are cheaper, and that's why they can't make their living there and here. So I wish more people knew that.
Well, some people argue about that. Some people have said that what has happened with NAFTA is that small farmers, particularly in rural parts of Mexico, have been competed out of the market, and they're migrating here. And there's some evidence that there are wealth disparities that have increased in Mexico due to NAFTA. And when people are out of work, whether they've lost their farm or can't market, they're looking for economic alternatives. And I think that raises a very important point. If we're really worried about Mexican migration, we should be thinking what can we do to work with Mexico to improve their economy so people don't want to migrate here. That politically is a very difficult argument to make, because some would say, you mentioned all the responses. Spend money on Americans, not Mexicans. We can't trust that corrupt government. There's some issues. We can't trust that corrupt government anyway. And it's also a long-term process, right? I can't say infusion of infrastructure in Mexico is going to make it a better economy tomorrow or the next day, maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So it's really a long-term solution. But I agree, that's a hard issue. What was your second question?
I wondered, I don't think you said, what's the number of legal documented immigrants versus
currently?
undocumented? And also, do you have any figures for people leaving?
Yeah, there is a continuing out-migration that often isn't accounted for in these numbers, but I don't know the number off the top of my head. But it's a smaller. It's not. 12 million people haven't left when 12 million people came. It's a much smaller component. Legal immigrants annually, it's usually somewhere in the neighborhood, and it varies because there's some numerical limits, but there are also some categories of immigrants that there are no numerical limits, like people who marry citizens. There's no limits on how many that can be. So there's some variation every year. But we're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 1 million people a year.
Yeah. In response to a letter to the editor that I wrote, inveighing against the injustice of car impounds and roadblocks and so forth, there was a spate of letters in response, in which the writers said, well, what are we going to do? You can't allow people to drive without a license, and blah, blah, blah.
I think, I know I mean, what happens is that people drive without a license when they get arrested, they get their car impounded. And so what it's created all kinds of incentives, like you buy cheap cars and if you lose them, you lose them. You don't care so much, you don't try to get them back. It also has created the incentive that if you get pulled over, you try to evade arrest by running and making everybody's position more dangerous, including the police. But the question is, what do you do? And my response would be, what you do is you think more carefully about why you have licensing rules and what you want out of life. My selfish interest, I want safety and liability insurance out of my licensing rules. I'm not, and that's what's most important to me. I mean, we have an immigration bureaucracy that should be enforcing the immigration laws. If they're not doing their job, if we don't have laws that are reasonable, that's who I would be talking to. And I'd let the licensors do the licensing. I mean, one of the issues is, and this is a big issue, how much are we going to allow state and local police to be involved in immigration enforcement? I mean, because the traditional rule is the federal government deals with immigration enforcement. State and local police deal with local criminal law enforcement. And one of the communities they need a lot of help from are immigrant communities, because immigrant communities aren't going to report crime, be witnesses to crime in court, or have any dealings with police officers. I think the local police are going to turn them over to the Immigration Customs Enforcement. So some police departments, you might call them sanctuary cities if you want to disparage them, but like the LAPD, which isn't known as particularly soft on crime, they have a policy, Special Order 40, where they don't allow police to ask suspects or crime victims or witnesses their immigration status. If they get convicted of a crime, it's a whole different story. But at the outset, they don't want to be asking those questions because they don't want to scare the heck out of the community, so they don't want to deal with the police. And they don't view it as a sanctuary. We're not creating a sanctuary for immigrants. We're trying to be effective police enforcers. So I think that's the issue. I mean, and that's when people say, "Well, we can't allow it." I mean, that's the quick solution often is, "Well, what are we going to do? We should throw them in jail or deport them." I think we have to think more carefully about how the system is supposed to work, what we want it, how we want it to work, as opposed to build a bigger fence or throw them in jail or take their car or make their lives more miserable, put them in detention. That's apparently not working.
Two questions. First is a factual question for you. Of the, what did you say, 12 million undocumented?
11 to 12.
So of those, in your view, how many of those should we document? That's the first question. The second question is, to what extent, in your opinion, does xenophobia play a role here in our immigration politics and debates and laws?
Yeah, second question I answer first. It's hard to tell. Because I think there's some people with legitimate concerns with immigration and its impacts. And I think that there's some other people who have other reactions as well. I think there's some people who will say, we have Samuel Huntington wrote a book who are we? And he basically has a chapter on the Hispanicization of immigration, and he's complaining about too many Hispanic immigrants. And I would say, he's got an issue with Mexicans. It's hard to say he's got some other issue. And there are some, but there are a lot of legitimate issues that people can say. What about the economic impacts? What about the political impacts? What about enforcement? How it works? I don't put everybody in the sort of category. If you're against immigration reform, you're anti-immigrant or you're racist. But there's some people like that. I think the minute and when you talk to them, they'll say, I don't like. There are a lot of them will say, it's on YouTube. You can watch them on YouTube saying they don't like Mexicans. So it's not me saying it. And there's some people who are worried. And some would say what's going on in Arizona is a response to changing demographics. And I don't want to say all Arizonans are racist, but there are some people who are uncomfortable with the change. And I grew up in Los Angeles, and as Los Angeles changed over the years, I understand there are people who felt uncomfortable with that, uncomfortable with the influence of immigrant communities. Some of it was from El Salvador and LA and Mexico as well. And actually Monterey Park, the large Chinese migration there, Mexican Americans saying, well, where are all these Chinese people coming from? I understand that there's sometimes a discomfort with change. So it's hard for me to say. There's some out-and-out racists out there, but there are some people who say, what's best here? And so I don't want to disparage those people. I think it's hard. On the legalization, I think that Congress has, the Senate has had a number of proposals. For people, that makes some sense to me. And it's hard to say for a precise number how many should be legalized. People with serious criminal convictions probably shouldn't be legalized. People who are a true danger to our national security probably shouldn't be legalized. But I think we should look carefully at people who are here, pay their taxes, are working, are parts of their community. Whether we like it or not, and I probably like it more than some. We have undocumented immigrants who are part of our communities, part of our churches, part of our workplaces, part of our. I can talk about the Davis, part of our campus, it's the question is how do we integrate those people, particularly if they've been here for a period of time or parts of the community, because I don't think that there's, even though there are some people who would say deport them all. I think when it became, when people look at it, for long-term residents who are law-abiding, there's going to be a lot of, there'd be a lot of resentment if we started deporting people like that. So I think we're talking probably millions in the end, and that's what we legalized in the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. But I think that's only part of it. Unless we deal with legal immigration, we're going to end up 20 years from now with the same kind of situations we have today.
I was going to ask you what you think would happen if we were to deport everybody, like let's say we deported all 11 or 12 million, what would happen to our economy then?
I don't think we could, but it would cost, actually there was a study, Center for American Progress did a study and estimated it would cost billions of dollars for a number of years to do that, and then it still wouldn't be effective. So I don't see why we think it worked, because we're pouring more money into that than any time in U.S. history, and we're doing more than we've ever done in that. This president has deported more non-immigrants than any president ever, and it hasn't really changed what's going on. So I don't view that as the answer. I do think that you could expect some horrible stories from different communities about how people were affected. You had 400 people deported in Postville, Iowa, who were parts of the community, and you still hear horrible stories about how the families were affected. Because sometimes children or family members will stay when families get deported, and that has ripple effects on entire families, horrible ones at times. I think that the cost of employers as well. I guess apparently McDonald's can operate very well around here without that. But I think that you'd have economic, you'd have social, you'd have community impacts that I don't think at the end people would put up with.
interesting article in today's New York Times about, after the defeat of the so-called DREAM Act, anxiety for illegal immigrant students. Can you comment on this situation?
Yeah, it's horrible. Because the DREAM Act is an act, it's had gone through various incarnations for over the last 10 years. It was initially sponsored by, among others, Orrin Hatch from Utah, a Republican, conservative Republican. It was designed to give legal status to undocumented college students. The current version, that was just voted down or didn't get out of the Senate, would have allowed legalization of college graduates as well as some who served in the military service, serve their country in the military service to regularize their status. There are on all UC campuses a number of undocumented students, students who don't have Social Security numbers and who attend. And I think that they feel very vulnerable. And I assume the same is true for the CSU system as well. Feel very vulnerable, very much under attack. And there are students who aren't eligible for financial aid. They're not eligible for federally subsidized loans. And they're getting their fees raised through the roof, certainly in our system, at a time when they're not eligible for any, and they're not eligible to work legally as well. And actually, I thought, correctly, unfortunately, I thought that the DREAM Act was not going to pass. But there are many students on the UC Davis campus, and I'm not talking about thousands of students, but there's students, and they're fairly well organized, who really thought that there was a chance that it was going to pass and thought it would change their lives. And I didn't have the heart to tell them I didn't think it was going to pass, even if I wanted it to. But I do think that, and I give talks at community colleges, and I run into community college students all the time to say that they had been in the CSU or UC, but are now going to community college because they can afford it. And it's amazing. Well, maybe I shouldn't say too much, but they're so worried about if they're driving and they get pulled over, that they might end up getting deported. That in Davis, where there's on Fridays and actually sometimes during the police will have checkpoints, check registrations on license, and whether people are drinking. There's a group of undocumented students who text each other to let them know that they shouldn't be driving down that street so they don't run into problems with the police. It's a very organized, active group, at least on our campus, who feel disenfranchised, disheartened, and unappreciated. And actually, currently, there's a group who are trying to get a panel discussion on campus. Actually, some ways like this immigration series, talking about civility in the immigration debate, because they're fearing that the debate is so uncivil at so many corners. They want to have some people come talk to the students and the faculty about how it should be more civil. So I think out of all undocumented immigrants, college students and military veterans probably are the most most valued in some ways, and they still didn't get the DREAM Act through Congress, which is disheartening for some people who've been working for immigrants' rights for a number of years.